April in Naples never knew how to be gentle with anyone. The sun still blazed as if nothing had happened. The ocean breeze still drifted in from the Gulf of Mexico, carrying the familiar scent of salt from a perfect afternoon. And the white lilies, the flowers Arthur Sterling had never liked, still flooded the funeral home with their suffocating fragrance, as if someone had placed them there to torment the people left behind.
Eleanor stood straight beside the polished walnut casket, her hands folded neatly in front of her, her eyes fixed on the empty space ahead. 80 years old, yet she still carried herself like a marble statue, spine perfectly upright, chin slightly raised, silver hair cropped with meticulous precision. The dark blue silk blouse she wore today was the one Arthur had given her on their 40th wedding anniversary. He had told her the color matched her eyes. She had never asked why.
People came to offer condolences in waves. Elderly couples from Pelican Bay, Arthur's former colleagues from his years managing investment funds, neighbors from the Homeowners Association Eleanor met every Tuesday morning during community meetings. They held her hands and repeated the same phrases Eleanor had memorized after 55 years among the upper circles of high finance.
He was a wonderful man. We'll miss him dearly. If you need anything at all, call us. She nodded, smiled just enough. Not a single tear. Not because she wasn't in pain, but because Eleanor Sterling had learned a very long time ago that tears were a luxury she could never afford to let others see. Julian arrived at 4 p.m, after most of the guests had already left. He entered the funeral home wearing a navy suit so perfectly pressed it barely showed a wrinkle. The kind of $4,000 suit bought with a credit card already close to its limit. Hair slicked back, shoes polished. A smile carefully measured to appear sorrowful without actually feeling sorrow. At 28, Julian Mercer, Arthur's only nephew, the son of Arthur's late sister, had already mastered a valuable skill, looking like he cared. Aunt Eleanor. He stepped closer, bending slightly as if to hug her. I'm sorry I'm late. My flight from New York was delayed. Eleanor looked at him. Just looked. The last time she had seen Julian was 8 months earlier, when he called asking to borrow money to invest in a very promising blockchain project. Arthur had refused. Julian hung up without another word. You arrived at the right time, she said. Eleanor Sterling's voice never wavered. Every syllable was controlled, like numbers inside a balance sheet. Julian sat beside her, hands clasped together, staring at the casket with appropriate solemnity. Then, after a silence carefully measured to appear respectful, he reached into the inside pocket of his jacket and pulled out a white envelope. Aunt Eleanor, he said quietly, lowering his voice, I know this isn't the right moment, but there are certain legal matters that need to be handled quickly. My attorney already prepared the documents. Eleanor did not take the envelope immediately. She looked at it for a second, as though reading a contract without opening it. What kind of documents? She asked. The estate property. Julian placed the envelope on the chair between them. According to Uncle Arthur's will, the residence has been transferred into his estate. And according to the opinion of certain specialists, you require assistance with major financial decisions. This is a temporary notice suspending your residential rights, pending legal competency review. The air inside the room seemed to thicken. Eleanor Sterling looked at her nephew, truly looked at him,
The way she once looked at CEOs trying to explain why their company books no longer matched reality.
She recognized 3 things instantly.
Julian had planned this long before boarding his flight. He was betting her grief would leave her unable to respond, and the phrase legal competency was a carefully calculated lever meant to destroy her right here on Arthur's funeral day. "You'll need to leave the house before 10 tonight," Julian continued, his tone as gentle as if discussing the weather. "To avoid legal complications. I already booked you a suite at the Ritz-Carlton. You'll be comfortable there while everything is reviewed."
Mr. Miller, retired Judge Richard Miller, seated 2 rows behind them, leaned slightly forward when he heard those words. His gray eyes studied Julian for a long moment before shifting toward Eleanor. He said nothing, but his gaze, the gaze of a man who had spent 35 years on the bench, recorded everything.
Eleanor picked up the envelope. She opened it, removed the document inside, and read it from beginning to end with the speed of someone who had processed millions of pages of legal paperwork in her lifetime.
30 seconds. Not faster, not slower. Then she folded the paper carefully and slipped it into her black leather handbag. "All right," she said. Julian failed to hide the flicker of surprise crossing his face. He had clearly prepared for a very different reaction.
"You're agreeing?"
"I'm going home to pack my things." Eleanor stood, straightened the folds of her silk blouse, and looked at Julian one final time with eyes completely unreadable to him. "Thank you for coming to say goodbye to Arthur." Then she turned and walked toward the exit, her heels striking the marble floor in calm, measured rhythm. Not hurried, not hesitant. Outside, the Florida sunlight still poured down as if nothing in the world had changed. But inside Eleanor Sterling's mind, the gears had already begun turning. At 9:47 that night, a taxi stopped in front of the mansion gates. Eleanor stepped out, carrying 2 silver Rimowa suitcases and a hard case filled with documents. Not the Ritz-Carlton. She had booked a room at a small seaside motel called Pelican Inn, the last place anyone would think to search for her. Julian watched from the second-floor balcony, a glass of wine in hand, wearing the expression of a man who believed he had already won the game. What he didn't know was that Eleanor had never played chess. She played auditing. Pelican Inn was not a place meant for someone like Eleanor Sterling. Room 14 overlooked the parking lot instead of the ocean. The air conditioner rattled loudly every time it started. The turquoise carpet had faded sometime in the previous decade, and the desk shoved against the wall, cheap pressed wood coated with imitation walnut veneer, trembled slightly whenever she rested her hands on it. Eleanor sat down, surveyed the room once, then opened the document case. There was no time to grieve over things that didn't matter. She began with the folder at the bottom, the oldest one. The brown leather cover was worn with age. Arthur's handwriting still visible in the upper right corner. Sterling Family Trust. Established 1987. 38 years. She remembered the night they sat with attorney Howard Kessler in his Midtown Manhattan office to sign those papers. Arthur had worn a white dress shirt with his tie loosened because of the heat. "Are you sure about this?" he had asked her. "Once assets go into the trust, changing anything becomes complicated." "That," Eleanor had replied, "is exactly why we're doing it." She turned the pages with the practiced fingers of a woman who had touched millions of contracts in her lifetime. Her hands,
did not shake. They never had. And that fact gave her more pride than almost anything else.
The first 12 pages contained standard clauses. She skimmed past them. On page 13, she reached the section she was searching for. Conditions of inheritance and beneficiary rights. Now she slowed down. With a pencil, she circled 3 passages. Then she opened the second folder. The 2019 amendment. The revision she and Arthur completed after changes in Florida law. There it was. Clause 7, Section C, subsection 3. She read it a second time. Then a third. Not because she had forgotten. She remembered every word, since she herself had instructed the attorney to add the clause decades ago. But because she wanted to make sure it was still intact after all these years. It was exactly the same. Every comma untouched. Eleanor set down the pencil, leaned back in her chair, and stared at the ceiling for a long moment. Then she picked up the phone and called Richard Miller. Richard Miller arrived at 8 o'clock the next morning, carrying 2 cups of coffee from the shop along Gulf Shore Boulevard. At 82, he still drove the same silver Honda Accord he had bought in 2015, refusing to replace it, no matter how much his children insisted. He knocked 3 times, exactly 3, no more, no less, as he always did. "I was wondering when you'd finally call," he said, when Eleanor opened the door. "I needed one night to organize my thoughts." She accepted the coffee and offered him the better chair, though none of the chairs in this room could honestly be called good. "Sit down," she said. "There's a lot to discuss." Miller sat, placing his coffee on the table while his eyes moved across the stacks of documents spread before her. He immediately understood the situation. He did not ask if she was all right. He had known Eleanor Sterling long enough to understand that such a question was both unnecessary and potentially irritating. "The trust fund," he said. "Not a question." "And the power of attorney," Eleanor replied. "Julian used a POA document to sign the temporary suspension notice regarding my residency rights. I need to know where it was notarized and when." Miller frowned. "Did Arthur ever sign power of attorney over to Julian?" "No." Eleanor's voice remained calm and flat as still water. "Arthur didn't trust Julian enough to sign a receipt for bread. But Arthur was diagnosed with mild cognitive decline last January. Enough for Julian to argue that he was no longer fully competent when he refused to sign." "And you think Julian forged it?" Eleanor opened the third folder, a brown envelope she had taken from the safe before leaving the house the night before. Inside was a copy of Arthur's medical certification from December, 3 weeks before the signature date listed on the power of attorney Julian had presented. Dr. Marcus Webb, Naples Neurology Clinic, confirmed Arthur Sterling was fully legally competent at the time of examination. She slid the document toward Miller. "Julian's POA claims it was signed 3 weeks later. There are no additional medical evaluations between those dates, and Arthur never once mentioned it to me." Miller adjusted his glasses and read the paper carefully, nodding slowly. "All right," he said, "but this only raises doubts about the validity of the POA. To invalidate it, you'll need..." "Verified signature authentication." Eleanor nodded. "I know. But first, I want to discuss the trust fund." She turned to the marked page and rotated the folder so Miller could read it. Her finger rested on Clause 7, Section C, subsection 3. Miller read it. "Then read it again." When he finally looked up at Eleanor,
His expression held something he had rarely shown during 35 years on the bench. Genuine surprise. You inserted this back in 2019?
Back in 1987, Eleanor corrected him. The 2019 version merely updated the legal wording to comply with current Florida law. The substance never changed.
She took a sip of coffee. Any beneficiary of the trust fund must maintain valid membership status within the homeowners association, comply fully with all property use regulations, and may not use estate assets for commercial purposes or financial collateral without written consent from all surviving trustees.
The room fell silent.
And all surviving trustees, Miller said slowly, currently means only one person.
Exactly. Eleanor placed the coffee cup down carefully.
I'm still alive, Richard.
But that was only half of it.
That afternoon, after Miller left, Eleanor opened her laptop, an old ThinkPad she kept separate from any account connected to Arthur or the family, and began tracing the money. Forensic auditing had taught her one thing no university ever could. Money never truly disappears. It only moves. And if you are patient enough, you always find the trail. She started with Arthur's classic car collection. 12 vehicles, last appraised the previous year at $2.3 million. According to the trust, these assets belonged to a specially protected category and could only be liquidated with approval from the Board of Trustees.
Eleanor was now the only remaining trustee.
Then she moved on to something even more important, something she was certain Julian didn't even know existed. In 1994, Arthur had opened a certificate of deposit at a small bank in Naples, not the family's primary bank, but a tiny branch of a community credit union where he personally knew the president. The CD renewed automatically every 5 years, with withdrawal restrictions requiring signatures from both spouses jointly, or, in the event of one spouse's death, from the surviving spouse, along with authorization from a third party appointed by the trust fund. That third party was Judge Richard Miller. Arthur had arranged it 32 years ago, without telling anyone else.
He only told Eleanor on the night of their 30th wedding anniversary, while they sat on the lanai overlooking the Intracoastal, drinking wine and talking about the things people usually avoid discussing.
If something happens to me before you, Arthur had told her, remember the little CD at First Community Credit Union. I left enough there so you'd never have to depend on anyone. Eleanor typed the bank's name into the search bar and looked up the number. After 32 years of compounded interest and continuous renewal, she calculated silently in her head, the balance would no longer be a small amount. That night, Eleanor lay on the stiff hotel mattress, staring at the ceiling in the dark.
She imagined Julian sleeping in the master bedroom of the mansion, the bedroom she and Arthur had shared for 20 years.
She thought about the classic car collection in the garage, the 12 cars Arthur had spent a lifetime building. She thought about the keepsakes on the bookshelves, their wedding photograph, the handwritten birthday card Arthur gave her on her 60th birthday, the notebook he used to track investment portfolios for over 4 decades.
She didn't know what Julian had done with those things.
But she would soon. Eleanor closed her eyes. Inside her mind, numbers and legal clauses slid neatly into place, precise, orderly, airtight, like a balance sheet, perfected after years of work. She had designed this trap back in 1987. She simply never imagined she would actually need to use it. But now she did. And Eleanor Sterling had never left an audit unfinished. During the first week, Julian Mercer did exactly what he had always done whenever he got what he wanted. He threw parties.
On the first Friday after the funeral, luxury cars began arriving at the mansion shortly after 9 o'clock at night.
A yellow Lamborghini, a black Range Rover, a convertible Porsche whose driver blasted the horn repeatedly before parking directly on the lawn. The same lawn Arthur's gardener had trimmed every Monday morning for 15 straight years. By 9:30, music thundered through the neighborhood, loud enough that Mrs. Kowalski from house number 7 had to shut her windows despite the cool evening air. Guests came and went until nearly 2 in the morning. Richard Miller stood on his front porch, only 2 houses away from the Sterling estate, watching quietly with a cup of tea gone cold in his hand. He did not call Eleanor immediately. Instead, he wrote everything down in the small notebook he had carried since his years on the bench. Date, start time, end time, estimated number of vehicles, noise level. Richard Miller was a patient man. He had spent 35 years as a judge. He understood that given enough time, people usually created evidence against themselves. By the second week, Julian moved into the next phase. On Tuesday morning, he hired an appraisal company to visit the estate. 3 men wearing navy polo shirts with the logo Prestige Asset Valuation embroidered across the chest, carrying cameras and tablets as they walked directly into the garage. Arthur Sterling's car collection was not something ordinary people could fully appreciate. 12 vehicles, ranging from the burgundy red 1965 Jaguar E-Type, the first car Arthur bought with his bonus from his first year on Wall Street, to the Ferrari 275 GTB/4 he had spent 17 years searching for before finally purchasing it from a collector in Italy. Every car carried history. Every car carried a story Arthur had repeated so many times, Eleanor knew them by heart, despite having no interest in automobiles herself. That afternoon, from her hotel room window, Eleanor received a text from Maria, the housekeeper who had worked for the Sterling family for 18 years and still kept a spare key to water the plants out of old habit. Mrs. Eleanor, they're taking photos of Mr. Arthur's cars. I overheard Julian on the phone. I think he wants to sell everything. Eleanor read the message, set the phone down, looked out the window. Then she picked the phone back up and called her attorney in Miami. But the thing that truly changed everything wasn't the cars. It was Thursday afternoon of the second week when Julian decided to clean out Arthur's office. Maria called this time, instead of texting. Her voice trembled faintly through the phone. Mrs. Eleanor, I need to tell you something. Julian, he's throwing things out. Big cardboard boxes. I saw picture frames, Mr. Arthur's notebooks, and I think the small wooden box you always kept on the bookshelf is there too. Eleanor immediately knew which box she meant. The small teakwood box with the brass lock. The one Arthur bought during their trip to Bangkok in 1978. The only trip they ever took where they could afford plane tickets, but not a proper hotel, renting instead a tiny 4th-floor room in a building without an elevator. Inside the box was a photograph of the 2 of them sitting on a boat along the Chao Phraya River, a silver Thai coin given to them by a street vendor after watching them bargain for nearly 20 minutes, and a small handwritten note Arthur wrote on their final night in Bangkok. No matter how much or how little we ever have, I promise I will always be the man sitting beside you on that boat. Eleanor had kept that box for 47 years. Where is it now? She asked. Her voice did not shake. But Maria must have heard something else.
And in the farthest corner, beneath one of Arthur's old navy wool coats, the coat he wore every winter back in New York, rested the teak wood box. Eleanor bent down and picked it up. The brass lock was still intact. Everything inside remained untouched. The faded photograph, the silver coin, and the small handwritten note in Arthur's aging ink, still perfectly readable after all these years. She stood there beneath the streetlight, holding the box in both hands, and looked up toward the second-floor windows of the mansion, where warm yellow light spilled into the night along with the sound of laughter. Julian stood on the balcony, cell phone pressed against his ear, speaking loudly enough for Eleanor to hear from the street below. "Tell them the property will be ready in 6 weeks. I need the deposit before the end of the month so I can settle things with the guys in Vietnam." "No, don't worry about the old woman. She's not lucid enough anymore to understand what's happening." His laughter echoed through the quiet streets of the wealthy Naples neighborhood. Eleanor looked up for another moment. Then she...
"We have already sent written notices to the current resident," Patricia said, in the same flat tone she might use to read a financial report. "No response has been received." Eleanor raised her hand. "Mrs. Nguyen," she said, her voice carrying clearly through the room, "I would like clarification regarding HOA enforcement procedures when the occupant is not the registered property owner." Patricia looked at her immediately, recognizing this was not an ordinary question. "According to the bylaws, occupants must be formally authorized in writing by the registered owner. Without valid authorization, the HOA may require proof of residency rights and suspend member privileges. And in cases involving serious violations of property use regulations," Eleanor continued, "the HOA may require legal intervention." Patricia paused briefly. "Are you suggesting we do that?" "I'm suggesting the HOA fulfill its responsibilities," Eleanor replied calmly. "According to the bylaws, according to every word written in them." Richard Miller sat beside her without turning his head, but gave the slightest nod, slow, subtle, visible only to Eleanor. That afternoon, Julian Mercer received 2 documents at the exact same time. The first was an official notice from the Homeowners Association demanding proof of lawful residence.
The creditors informed him the deadlines remained unchanged, and suddenly Julian found himself standing alone in the enormous living room of the Sterling mansion, marble floors beneath him, vaulted ceilings above him, glass windows overlooking the shimmering intracoastal waters in the late afternoon sun, realizing for the first time that he might be losing a game whose rules he didn't even understand. 20 minutes away, inside a small roadside hotel, Eleanor Sterling sat at the wobbling desk in room 14 and opened her laptop. Then she began drafting an email. She typed slowly, not because her fingers were weak, but because every word was chosen with the precision of a contractual clause. Recipient: Collier County District Attorney's Office. Subject: request for investigation into power of attorney fraud and trust fund violations. She attached 17 documents. Then she pressed send, stood up, and stepped onto the tiny balcony outside room 14, looking down at the parking lot glowing beneath yellow lights. The Naples night was clean and quiet. Far away, somewhere beyond rows of palm trees and red-tiled rooftops, stood her mansion, lights still glowing, faint music still drifting through the wind. But now, none of it unsettled her anymore. Thursday morning in Naples was beautiful in a strangely indifferent way. It simply pulled to the curb, the doors opened, and 2 officers stepped out in sharply pressed uniforms beneath the morning sun. Julian answered the door at 8:17. His hair was still messy. He wore a t-shirt and pajama pants, holding a steaming cup of coffee, Clearly, he had not expected visitors this early, and certainly not this kind of visitor. "Mr. Julian Mercer?" the lead officer asked. His badge read Rodriguez. "Yes?" Julian looked from one officer to the other, still confused. "Is there a problem?" "Would you mind stepping outside for a moment, sir?" That was the exact moment Julian realized this was not a social visit. He set down the coffee cup, stepped onto the porch, and only then did he notice everything else. A vehicle from the district attorney's office parked behind the patrol car, a man in a gray suit leaning against the hood while opening a briefcase full of documents. And the sight that made Julian's stomach tighten instantly, Eleanor Sterling standing at the curb roughly 15 meters from the gate. She wore a navy silk suit, silver.
The man in the gray suit stepped forward. Assistant District Attorney Delgado, according to the badge on his lapel.
"Mr. Mercer, we have a court order requiring your cooperation in the investigation of the following allegations." He read from the paper in a voice as steady as someone reading a shopping list. "First, forgery of a power of attorney under the name of Arthur Sterling, signed on January 14th, 2025. Second, violation of the anti-misappropriation clause within the Sterling family trust, including the attempted sale of assets listed under protected holdings without the approval of the Board of Trustees. Third, unlawful use of the property at this address for commercial purposes and unauthorized financial collateralization."
Julian opened his mouth, closed it, opened it again. He stopped, trying to recover the composure he always carried like a shield. "This is a misunderstanding. I have legal rights to this property under Arthur's will."
Mr. Mercer, Delgado interrupted him, gently but firmly. "Would you like to review the evidence first?"
That was when Eleanor stepped forward. Not hurried, not dramatic. She walked through the gates into the courtyard of her own estate, the way someone returns home after an afternoon of shopping. Natural, familiar, as though the previous 2 weeks had never happened. She opened her handbag, removed a blue hardbound file, and placed it on the portable desk Delgado had opened on the hood of the car. "Document 1, she said, in the voice of someone who had once presented before the boards of Fortune 500 companies, is the medical certification issued by Dr. Marcus Webb of Naples Neurology, dated December 24th, 2024, confirming that Arthur Sterling was fully legally competent at the time of examination." She turned to the next page. "Document 2 is the power of attorney Mr. Mercer used to sign the notice suspending my residency rights. It is dated January 14th, 2025, 21 days after Dr. Webb's certification, and there exists no additional medical documentation indicating any change in Arthur Sterling's cognitive capacity during that period." She turned to the third page. "Document 3 is a signature analysis conducted by a federally certified forensic document examiner, comparing Arthur Sterling's signature on the power of attorney against 17 other authenticated signatures dated between 2020 and 2024. This time, she paused, looked at Julian. "The examiner concluded that the probability of the signature being authentic is 3.7%. Julian Mercer, 28 years old, polished and arrogant, a man who had grown up believing the world belonged to people who knew exactly what to say at exactly the right moment, stood completely still. Not because he was thinking of a rebuttal, but because, for the first time in his life, he was witnessing something he did not know how to fight. Someone using truth itself as a weapon, and doing so without the slightest trace of emotion. Eleanor turned another page. Document 4 is the collateral agreement signed by Mr. Mercer with Apex Capital Group on April 3rd,
6 days after Arthur Sterling's funeral, using this estate as security for a $1.8 million loan. Apex Capital Group is currently under investigation by the SEC for activities related to cryptocurrency investment fraud.
She turned another page. Document 5 is an extract from Clause 7, Section C, Subsection 3 of the Sterling Family Trust, established in 1987 and legally updated in 2019, which clearly states that any use of trust assets for commercial or financial purposes without written consent from all surviving trustees shall constitute a violation of the Anti-Misappropriation Clause and result in the complete forfeiture of beneficiary rights. She closed the file.
"I am the only surviving trustee," Eleanor said, "and I have signed no such authorization."
The courtyard fell silent enough that the sound of waves from the intercoastal could be heard drifting from behind the house. Delgado looked at Julian. "Would you like to contact your attorney before we continue?"
Julian turned toward his lawyer, who had arrived late and now stood near the edge of the courtyard with the expression of a man calculating whether he should step forward at all. The lawyer met Delgado's eyes, then looked at the blue file on the desk, then back at Julian, and gave the slightest shake of his head. That was the moment Julian Mercer understood everything. Not legal understanding. Understanding. Something deeper than that. The understanding of a man standing in front of a brick wall and realizing he had been running directly toward it long before the collision ever happened. "All right," he said. For the first time in 3 weeks, his voice no longer sounded polished. What remained was simply the real voice of a frightened 28-year-old man who no longer had anywhere left to hide. "All right, I need to make a phone call." They allowed him to go inside to retrieve his phone, with one officer accompanying him. Eleanor remained standing in the courtyard, not watching Julian. Instead, she looked toward the lanai, the back terrace overlooking the intracoastal, where she and Arthur used to sit every evening drinking tea together. From where she stood, she could not actually see the lanai, but she knew it was there. She knew the afternoon sunlight was falling across the blue granite tiles they had purchased from a small craftsman workshop in Vermont in 2003. She knew Arthur's wicker chair was still there too, with the blue cushion she had sewn herself. "You did well," Miller said, softly beside her. "I only did my job," Eleanor replied. "You did more than that." He looked at her. Arthur would be proud. She did not answer immediately. Instead, she looked at the house, the mansion she and Arthur had built, not only with money, but with 20 years of shared life inside it, with mornings over coffee and afternoons by the sea, and evenings spent reading together in the kind of warm silence only people who truly understand each other can share. "I didn't do this to prove anything to anyone," she finally said. "I did it because this is our home, and nobody has the right to take away what people spend a lifetime building." As the police car prepared to leave, Julian seated inside, not handcuffed, but ordered to report to the district attorney's office the following morning. There was a moment when he turned and looked back through the window. Eleanor stood on the front steps of her home, speaking with Patricia Nguyen from the HOA and Mrs. Kowalski next door. Nobody was watching the car leave. Nobody seemed interested in seeing him go. And that was when Julian understood that this had never been revenge. She had never done any of this because of him. She did it for Arthur. For the little teakwood box with the silver tie coin and the faded handwritten note. For the lanai and the evenings spent drinking tea.
and the 20 years of shared life whose value he had deliberately refused to understand. The car rolled out through the gates, down the red brick streets of the neighborhood, past rows of perfectly straight palm trees beneath the Florida morning sun.
Julian kept looking through the window until the mansion disappeared around the curve of the street. Eleanor stepped into the house for the first time in 19 days. She stood in the foyer and looked around. Some things were different. A few paintings hung in the wrong places. The sofa had been shifted. Traces of unfamiliar perfume still lingered faintly in the air. She had not yet dared to look inside the garage. She still did not know how many of Arthur's cars remained untouched. But the marble floor still carried the same familiar coolness beneath her feet. The sunlight still poured through the tall windows in patterns she knew by heart at every hour of the day. And from the foyer, she could see through the living room, through the great glass doors out toward the lanai, where afternoon sunlight spread gold across the waters of the Intracoastal. She placed her handbag on the foyer table. Then she walked through the living room, through the glass doors, and out onto the lanai. Arthur's wicker chair was still there, the blue cushion slightly crooked. She straightened it gently. Then she sat down in her own chair, the one beside his, slightly smaller, with the worn spot on the left armrest she had intended to replace 3 years ago, but never did, because her hand had grown used to it. The afternoon sunlight stretched across the water. A gray heron stood motionless on the opposite shore, as though it had stood there forever. Farther away, a small sailboat drifted lazily with the current. Eleanor looked at all of it, and for the first time since Arthur's funeral, she allowed her eyes to sting. Not crying out loud, just sitting there in the afternoon sun, allowing the thing she had held inside herself for 19 days to finally rest for a moment. Just a moment. Then she would stand again, because there was still one final act left to complete. 3 weeks later, Naples returned to its own rhythm. Every morning, the golf carts rolled once more through the neighborhood streets. The retirees resumed their Tuesday gatherings at the community center. Mrs. Kowalski planted petunias along her fence again, and the Intercoastal still shimmered every afternoon, as though nothing in the world could matter enough to disturb the surface of the water for more than a few seconds. At 7 each morning, Eleanor Sterling drank coffee on the lanai and watched a brown pelican dive toward the water, precise and decisive, before rising again with a fish in its beak. Beautiful, she thought. Then she took another sip of coffee. The investigation into Julian was still ongoing. Things like this never ended quickly, and Eleanor understood that better than anyone. He was in New York now, released on bail under the condition that he surrender his passport, waiting for a trial that his attorneys were trying to delay by every means possible. It could take a year, maybe longer. Eleanor no longer cared about the pace of it. Her part was finished. She had placed the truth into the hands of the people responsible for holding it: the courts, the district attorney's office, and the board of trustees. From this point forward, the system would operate the way it had been designed to operate. She believed in that, not blindly, but because she had spent her entire life designing structures meant to function correctly even when people did not. Arthur's car collection was returned intact, all 12 vehicles, because Julian had not managed to sell a single one before the asset freeze took effect. One afternoon, Eleanor stood in the garage and walked slowly along the line of cars, her fingertips lightly brushing the door of the Bordeaux red Jaguar E-Type. The paint was still smooth as silk beneath her hand. She did not know how to drive classic cars, never had.
but she knew the story behind every single one, and that was enough. On a Wednesday morning, Eleanor drove to the office of Howard Kessler Jr., the son of Howard Kessler, the attorney who would help.
Howard took notes. What scale are you envisioning? Eleanor paused for a moment, not because she had not already calculated it. She had done that long ago, but because she wanted to say the number out loud once, to make it real. 30% of my personal assets outside the trust fund, including the CD at First Community Credit Union. She looked at Howard. Arthur left it there untouched for 32 years. I think he wanted it to be used for something meaningful. Howard set down his pen and looked at her for a moment. You don't have to do this, Mrs. Sterling. After everything that's happened. It's precisely because of everything that's happened, Eleanor interrupted gently, that I know I need to do it. She looked out the window toward the parking lot outside, where palm trees stood straight beneath the midday sun, their shadows short and sharp across the asphalt. I spent my entire life working to protect what Arthur and I built. That was the right thing to do, and I don't regret any of it. She paused. But sitting alone in that small hotel room gave me a great deal of time to think. And I realized that Arthur's true legacy, our true legacy, is not the mansion or the car collection or the numbers sitting in bank accounts. It's what we learned, what we can pass on. A young secretary entered quietly with more tea, set it down gently, then left again. Arthur always used to say that financial knowledge is the only thing nobody can ever take away from you. Not money, not...
He folded the paper when he saw her walking up the driveway and poured another glass of lemonade from the pitcher on the table. Sit down, he said. Not a question. Eleanor sat in the white wooden chair across from him, accepted the lemonade, looked out over the small garden Miller maintained himself, the red bougainvillea bushes, the short line of cacti along the path, and the old frangipani tree in the corner of the yard, blooming in brilliant white. I wanted to thank you, she said. I didn't do very much. You were there, Eleanor replied. That was enough. They sat quietly for a while, the way old friends often do, without feeling the need to fill silence with unnecessary words. Birdsong drifted from somewhere in the trees. A golf cart rolled past on the street, its driver lifting a hand in greeting. Miller lifted his own hand back. Richard, Eleanor said, using his first name for the first time in years instead of his surname. Do you ever regret the choices you made? Miller actually thought about it. He did not answer immediately, the way people often do with questions like that. Yes, he said at last. I regret not spending enough time with my family while I was on the bench. I thought my work was too important. He looked down at the lemonade in his hand. Turns out, everything is important, just in different ways.
But you did understand eventually, Miller said. Yes, Eleanor replied softly. Eventually. She took a sip of lemonade. A little late, but not too late. That Saturday, Eleanor did something she had not done in many years. She did not plan it in advance, did not check her calendar, did not prepare a list of things that needed to be done. She simply picked up the keys to the golf cart, the small white cart she and Arthur had bought in 2015, and used every Sunday morning to drive around the neighborhood, and drove out. There was no particular destination. She drove along the neighborhood's ring road, past the small park with its pond and flock of mallards, past rows of mansions with meticulously maintained gardens, past the main gate and out toward the larger road before circling back again. People saw her and waved. She waved back. Mrs. Kowalski was watering plants in her front yard and shouted, "Eleanor, aren't my petunias beautiful this year?"
The prettiest in the neighborhood, Eleanor called back, without slowing down. 2 elderly men playing tennis at the community courts waved at her.
3 children, belonging to somebody in the neighborhood, were chasing each other across the grass. They paused for a moment to watch the little white cart pass by, then immediately resumed running again, as though nothing in the world could possibly matter more than their game.
Eleanor slowed the cart when she reached the stretch of road overlooking the Intracoastal, the place where the shimmering water could be seen between 2 rows of palm trees.
She stopped the cart there, did not turn off the engine, just sat quietly for a while, looking out at the water. The Florida afternoon was changing colors now. That particular golden orange light that seemed to exist only here, in this perfectly flat land where the sky occupied almost the entire horizon, and the water reflected everything above it. She thought about Arthur. Not the Arthur from the final days. Tired, slower now, seeming smaller inside the shirts he used to wear. But the Arthur from that first morning in 2003, when they drove down from New York to Florida together, and he suddenly pulled the car over beside some stretch of road overlooking the bay and said, "Do you see it? The sky feels bigger here." She had told him not to stop the car recklessly in the middle of the road. He laughed and kept driving. But she had seen it. She had always seen it. Sometimes she simply chose not to say it out loud. Eleanor Sterling, 80 years old, sat in her little white golf cart beneath the Florida afternoon sky, watching the waters of the Intracoastal change color beneath the fading sunlight, and smiled. Not the carefully measured social smile she had practiced for decades in boardrooms and upscale parties, but a real smile, the kind where the eyes smile too, the kind people only wear when there was finally nothing left to hide. She started the cart again and turned back toward home. Behind her, the water continued to shimmer. Ahead of her, the neighborhood road stretched straight beneath the evening sun, lined on both sides by palm trees standing like loyal sentries. And somewhere inside her waterfront mansion, in the study that smelled faintly of old books and walnut wood, upon the desk where Arthur had worked for 20 years, the files had finally been closed, returned to their proper places, neat and complete. Like an audit finally concluded after every number had been restored to exactly where it belonged.